Good morning, everybody. I think some people will still be joining, but we'll kick off in the interests of time. Welcome to this morning's webinar. Thank you for joining us to talk about the Global Risks Report and everything that falls out of it for the UK public sector. I'm Alex Bedford, if I haven't met you before, and I'm the Risk Proposition Manager at Zurich Municipal. This webinar is the first in what we are calling the Zurich Municipal Risk Series. Every month we will bring you a webinar on different risk topics that are common across all of the ZM customer markets. Next month we will be talking about underinsurance and the impact on your assets and their resilience. So look out for an invitation to that coming into your mailbox soon. But for today, I am joined by Martin Clement and Matt Hardwick from the Risk and Resilience team in Zurich Resilience Solutions. For those of you who don't know them, Martin and Matt are senior risk consultants with a wealth of experience working with and within the public and voluntary risk world. So we are in great hands for today's discussion. Just to let everyone know, we are recording the session, and a link will be sent to you so that you can watch it back should you so wish, or so that you can share with colleagues who you think might be interested in the content that we're going to be going through today. And you've all joined with cameras and microphones off, but there will be time for a Q&A after we've finished speaking. So please do submit any questions you have either into the Q&A box or into the chat section on Teams. We'll sort it out. We would just love to have as many questions as you wish to submit so that we can have a really good discussion once we've gone through the main body of the presentation. So numbers have ticked up. Hopefully people have heard the majority of that introduction. We'll go into the main body of the presentation now. So the Global Risks Report 2025. It was published on the 15th of January. We've managed to get this webinar in fairly quickly after publication, which is great. And it is the 20th edition of the report. So I've been working on them for around 10 years, so for half of that time. The report, as always, presents the findings of the Global Risks Perception Survey, which captures insights from over 900 global experts. It analyses 33 risks, so people are given a list and asked to rank the risks that are within that list, and looks at them through three timeframes. So the current year, so 2025, the 2-year outlook and the 10-year outlook to 2035 to support decision makers in balancing current crises and longer term priorities. So looking at this slide, I am going to give a brief overview of the key findings of the report. I'm going to do this bit and then I'm going to hand over to Martin and Matt to look at the UK view and, most importantly, how we as risk professionals can respond and support our organisations and communities as we try to build resilience to the kinds of risks that are presenting on this slide and in that longer list as well. I mean, as we came into 2025, if anything, the global outlook is more divided than it was when we came into 2024. And I know in the few years before that, we were using the word unprecedented about the risk landscape. So we keep being proved wrong. It does seem increasingly fractured, environmental, societal, economic, all represented here. And we are seeing more conflict, extreme weather around the globe with the cycles. It seems it's a constant in different ways, widespread societal and political division. So no surprise to any of you that a majority of respondents are anticipating that unsettled outlook to continue over the next 2 years. What strikes me about this 2-year timeline is how societal risks are central to the risk landscape. So people, whatever the risk is, the ultimate impact is often felt by people. They're at the heart of many other risks, either they're causing risks to manifest, these societal risks, or they're being influenced by the way that society is changing and evolving. And underlying all of that is the fact that all of this weakens trust, which I know is a key risk theme for the UK public sector. That kind of trust in democratic processes, trust in what are traditional institutions, trust coming from communities. So those societal risks really are felt by all of us working in risk in the UK public sector. And there are 4 of them there in the top 10 over the next 2 years risk ranking. Then looking at the 10-year outlook, only 2 make it to that 10-year time frame, but actually inequality and social polarisation are 2 massive risks, an important pair of risks to monitor. And I know already work is underway to try and mitigate, but we can't let up on having that focus on inequality and social polarisation come through in the risk work that we're doing, as they do lead to that continued social instability, and they affect local politics and communities and the way in which we can deliver for those. The other big kind of glaring obvious point about the 10-year outlook is that the outlook for environmental risks, it remains, it has been for a long time, and it remains concerning. All 33 risks in the survey were expected to worsen in severity from the 2-year to the 10-year time horizon, but environmental risks are showing the greatest increase in severity, and extreme weather events are expected to become an even bigger issue than they are now. I don't expect that to be a surprise to you. It's not a surprise to us, and that focus on climate resilience, building resilience to those increasing extreme weather events, is that needs to continue. We need to try and find space within our risk work to put in those mitigations alongside everything else we need to do. Pollutions, and it was an interesting one. Sorry, go back a slide, Matt. Pollution is an interesting one in here. I just wanted to pull out, so one of the nuances in the report, which obviously, as always, is very long, so we haven't got time to cover it all here. But pollution is ranked differently, very differently, by the public sector and the private sector. So the fact that it's creeping into the top 10 here is because the public sector have rated it as a top 10 risk, where the private sector haven't. So if you wish, you can go in and look at how the different stakeholders rank different risks, and look at what really matters to the sector from which you are from, or the sectors with which you need to interact, because it's worth understanding those nuances. So looking at short-term versus long-term, so this comes through as the absolute key theme of the report, and I know it is a key theme that we are talking to you about all the time. We are facing a series of significant short-term shocks which are derailing efforts to try and look long-term. Every time you try and horizon scan, something else appears to be coming along and knocking the legs from under us. And it is meaning that focus on longer term threats such as the climate crisis cannot, or it feels like cannot, always be there. So looking at the 2025, what are those short term shocks that are hitting us? And again, the glaringly obvious and the risk that sort of stands out when you look at this is that state-based armed conflict being at the top. Conflict as a theme comes through from the report, an increase in conflict, societal, economic, geopolitical, and this state-based armed conflict, ranked as number 1, bearing in mind this is a global risk survey. But the impacts on supply chains, on migration, on societal tensions in some cases are felt here on the ground too. So conflicts, weather events, misinformation and disinformation, economic impacts, inequality, all risks on there, and all risks that I'm sure are hitting your desks in some way as we move into 2025. So that's the short term, and then looking at that long term again, just putting out that 10-year outlook, that this short term focus, the concern is that it is going to lead to a failure in action. on climate change, with all the impacts that are then mapped out there that will bring. It's been an overriding concern for the last few years. It's not going away. The threat remains high. We will continue to talk about it because from an asset insurance point of view, but also from a people point of view, because the impacts, as I said, are felt by people. This is front of mind for us. So short term, long term, there was an interesting quote at the launch of the report from Peter Geiger, who is the Group Chief Risk Officer at Zurich. You can see it on our website, but he said, when we talk about global risks, we tend to focus on the immediate, which is understandable, but the real story stretches further. The long term isn't as far away as we think. Every decision we make today moves us closer to resilience or further into crisis. And that's really the choice that we are helping our organisation navigate. How much can we spend moving closer to resilience? Because in responding, we're trying to fix the now. As we move forward, everything then becomes crisis because we haven't taken that longer term view and worked to fix resilience at the same time. So the UK view, there's always a lot more in the report than we can cover here, and actually there aren't significant changes this year to bring to you. Environment, misinformation, disinformation, societal risks still looming large. There is a really interesting section on ageing, including risks such as the pensions landscape and labour shortages, which, if you're interested, again, as I say, there is an awful lot on the website, which you can pick up. And economic risks are looming large when you get into some of the country-specific data, which again is available. So looking at the UK view here, for the next 2 years, the economy absolutely features in the top risks that those experts in the UK are worried about. So to look at that in a bit more detail and to share some insight from their work across the UK public and voluntary sectors, and then most importantly, as I said, take us into a discussion about what practical steps we as risk leaders can be taking, I'm going to hand over to Martin and Matt, and starting with Martin. Thank you.
Yes, good morning, everyone, and thank you very much, Alex, for distilling what is a complex and lengthy report into a nice 10-minute bite-sized introduction. So thank you for that. Matt and I are just going to focus a little bit on these UK risks and just share a little bit of our experience in terms of the work that we've done with our customers. What are we hearing? What are we seeing? And perhaps some insight for you here. So, as Alex said, focusing on the economic downturn, this is a complex risk, without any doubt about it. There are so many moving and interconnected parts when we consider it from an organisational perspective. I think if we take a little bit of a step back, as Alex said, the Global Risk Report is based on a perception survey which was available from October, November last year. So many of the UK respondents would have had an insight into the autumn budget. And at that point, like the autumn budgets, we were predicting basically a flat line in economic growth, and therefore pretty vulnerable even to the slightest shift. As of yesterday, that prediction has been halved in terms of economic growth, and we have also the potential for a global trade war looming. So I can quite understand why economic downturn is featuring so significantly on the risk register. And it is front and centre with many organisations that we work with. When we see economic downturn, we see increased demand for public services, particularly, but I would say not exclusively relating to health and social care. What then also happens is that the government receives reduced tax revenues through income tax, VAT, for example, less spending, which then places pressure on reducing public spending. So there's an impact on quality and availability of services. You've then got that interconnected risk of job insecurity, job losses, and increased workloads for those that remain in work. So I think this is a given. This is what we understand. That what is important that organisations understand that multi-impact nature on their organisations. And for me, this really highlights the importance of stress testing business plans as well as financial plans. understanding at what point they will break, and having in place what I would term sort of key risk indicators to provide early warning of failure, and also having that contingency plan as to when things start to unravel, what is our plan B? What I sometimes find is missing is this connection between, if you like, the financial stress testing and what is recorded or captured in risk registers, and actually having that accumulated view of the risk environment. And just to give you a little bit of an example as to what I mean by that, is that typically what I see in a strategic risk register will be like a risk around legislative change. Yesterday, we saw the Deputy Prime Minister announce the introduction of Arabs law in October this year. And I think most organisations on this call will have been preparing for it, but there's still an organisational impact. So as part of our financial stress testing, where we test sensitivities around, for example, interest rates and borrowing costs, we need to be integrating that with our risk registers and understand if risks materialise, what is the accumulated effect on that. I think it also interlinks with inflation, and what I'll do is, Matt, I believe you've got some observations on the inflation elements as well, haven't you?
Yeah, thanks, Martin, and yeah, good morning all. Lovely to sort of have the opportunity to have a chat to you this morning. Your points there, Martin, around risks being interconnected is something that I'm certainly seeing increasingly in the conversations that I'm having with organizations, is trying to bring their risk register to life and take it from just being that flat document that may sit on Excel or wherever, but actually realizing that, as you say, you might have a legislative one, you might have an economic one, and how that interacts with other key risks that you've got on the register. And I think this is a really great way of highlighting it within this top 5 view for the UK, of how that economic downturn, as you've just articulated, then has that knock-on impact in terms of inflation, from the real sense, if you like, from what we're seeing with organizations. That's having an impact on supply chain management. It's having impacts on projects, whether that's internal and including external stakeholders. The expenditure associated to some of those is shifting from what the original plans possibly were, and indeed the associated timescales for delivery of some of these projects is becoming impacted, which then in turn has a knock-on impact around the delivery into future elements and ultimately that community resilience that we're trying to provide our services for, if those timescales, those projects start shifting, and indeed the costs associated to them. And very much as equally as it's linked to the economic downturn, for me, it really is linked into that labour, that talent shortage. I know many organisations on this call, and peers and colleagues of yours across the network within the public sector market, whether that's voluntary, local government, or whatever bit within which you sit. But the repetitive nature of the conversation I've been having in the last sort of 12-18 months around certain key roles being difficult to appoint into, how do we attract people? I've seen people referring to it as, in some cases, a drain of resources out of public sector and a movement into other areas. And I think there's a likelihood that is, or the potential that could increase and have further and greater impacts going down the line. And I mean, Alex alluded to that short-term versus long-term, and we're going to pick up on some of these in a little bit more detail further through the content. But how do we make sure that we've got the right people here and available in post and able to deliver the services that we need, not just now, but equally the impact and the future benefits, and how that builds that future resilience and delivers those objectives, which I think are crucial for that future success. And I think that takes us nicely into the next bit. So Martin, back to you.
Actually, just before we do, and talk a little bit about resilience there, I think if I can just pick up on one thing there, Matt, because collectively, me and you, we're talking about risks in a negative perspective here, the downside. But clearly, some of these risks, if we look at them in broader terms, offer opportunities. If we take AI, for example, and the slide or the risk talks about the negative outcomes of AI, and clearly, if we're talking about self-replicating AI, that there is a risk there. But there's also clearly an opportunity, and this is the interconnected nature of risk, in that AI can help solve or address our skill shortage, for example. But what organisations have to be absolutely crystal clear on is what risks do they actively want to take. And here the role of the risk manager is to ensure to facilitate this clear, not just the understanding of risk appetite and the articulation of it, but to ensure that that risk appetite is appropriately what I would call operationalized as well. So Matt, yes, you mentioned sort of like resilience there, and I was wondering, so like, how do I define resilience? And I had a look in the dictionary, and it talks about so like the ability of an object to spring back into shape or elasticity. And I thought, well, actually, from a broad principle point of view, I'm quite happy with that. It's about responding to shock. But I think, you know, the question here on the slide is how do we maintain organisational resilience in the face of, you know, what we're seeing is volatility and significant change. And I think perhaps if I just flip that question a little bit and say actually what prevents organisations from being resilient, and again some of the things that we see in the work that we do supporting our customers, and I'll just list a couple of these things off. Clearly, you know, it needs clear and strong leadership and direction. It is absolutely critical in this face of complexity and volatility is that as organisations we understand the direction in which we are travelling, and everyone within that organisation is aligned with that thinking. But thinking more about so like a risk perspective, one of the things again which makes organisational resilience more challenging is what I would call is sort of insufficient access to data and insights, and that's impairing our ability to foresee or understand the future risk landscape, to understand future emerging trends and being able to respond proactively. I think this issue around inability to change, we may as an organisation have a desire or goal to change, but perhaps either cultural resistance or again this capacity to change may hinder us. Again, organisation resilience is dependent upon good and timely decision making, and again if we don't have the data or indeed the culture to support informed and timely decision making, that has a negative impact. And perhaps underpinning all of this, I would frame this as a poor culture or poor risk culture, or perhaps more appropriately described as having an inappropriate culture. And again, the way I perhaps try and describe this is the important thing is having a risk-aware culture. And this is about having or being comfortable with uncertainty, having an appreciation or understanding of risks where they can or cannot be taken, as I've talked about in terms of risk appetite. And also this desire to encourage the reporting of bad news, so that when things start to untangle or unwind, is that we understand what is happening, it's escalated to an appropriate level, and action is taken rather than hidden under the proverbial carpet. So when we look at or try to assess organisational resilience, what are the things that myself and Matt are looking for? And I think at the core, we would talk about people, process, and environment. I think starting at the organisational core, let's talk about people, having a resilient workforce. And Matt, again, has alluded to it in that opening slide about having the right people with the right skills and the experience in the right place at the right time. Clearly, this is a challenge when we're talking about skill shortages. But also this is about how organisations can flex their resource. So do we have that flexibility to adapt to a particular given situation? But I think as well, it is also important to think about how do we make sure that the individuals are resilient themselves. And this is about providing the right support for the workforce in times of what I would term like constant change. And this is not just about training and development opportunities. This is about providing, mental and emotional support as well through our employee assistance programs. So, people are absolutely core to organisational resilience. Then we talk about the processes themselves, having strong processes in place to ensure, we continue to deliver the key things, the key services, the key activities that we need to do during periods of organisational stress or disruption. But again, I think importantly, we talk about a deep understanding of what we term as the operating environment, either externally or internally now, and also in the future. And something which I come across quite a lot is perhaps this, what I would term so like an unexpected expectation that risk managers should be predicting the future. And this is not what risk and risk management is about. And I think as risk managers, we need to sort of frame it as future potential scenarios with a range of possible outcomes rather than a specific or singular outcome. And I think the other thing, again, I alluded to it on that initial slide, is just a key understanding of how risk flows through the organisation. For example, Alex talked about armed conflict or interstate conflict appearing at risk number 3 on the global risk report. I don't expect to see that on risk registers. But what I need to see or expect to see is how that risk flows through the organisation. We've talked about, for example, supply chain, for example, energy pricing, or indeed the threat of global war or interstate conflict may impact on things like public spending as governments start to shift spending more on defence rather than on public spending. So I think, a clear understanding of that is important as well. And again, Matt will talk about this a little bit later. It's creating insight and intelligence from your risk registers and perhaps questioning, is the use of Excel spreadsheets or Word documents, is that going to create the insight that we need? So I've talked about the core there in terms of the people, the process, and the understanding of the environment. And what we've done is we framed this in a organisational resilience model. And again, just to explain this in a little bit more detail, we have the core at the centre there, and around that centre we have what we call the disruption management cycle. And by disruption, I'm talking about both the sudden disruption and the, if you like, the creeping, gradual occurring disruption. If you recall, I used the definition in terms of defining resilience of the ability to spring back. I think perhaps just further expanding that, the ability to spring back needs us to think about how we anticipate the need to spring back, how we prepare for that, how we actually respond when that disruption occurs, and then our ability as an organisation to adapt to those disruptions. And then around the outside, and I think this is the real challenge for public sector organisations, everyone on this call, is to be truly resilient. We need this ability to stretch, and to stretch what we term to be almost these paradoxical states, if I can term it that way. So this is about being agile and innovative, whilst at the same time being consistent and stable. So those are quite paradoxical in their nature. And what this really requires is strong organisational leadership, absolutely. And within that definition of strong organisational leadership, I would say that requires strong risk leadership in its broader sense. And this is where I see a key role for the risk manager in driving what I would term a risk intelligent culture within the organisation, providing risk insight to leadership and management teams to guide the business planning process. And I know, Matt, you've gathered a number of thoughts in terms of that role of the risk manager now and in the future.
Yeah, thank you, Martin. And I agree. I think the risk manager is a unique role in some aspects within organisations. We're often the ones who have oversight of many different services, many different concerns. It gives us that intuition to embrace some of the conversations that Martin's alluded to in terms of, be provocative, be curious, and utilize those global trend information, but start to consider them and allow that challenge, that debate to flow through your own organizations. And I actually think we're at a point here where risk managers can be very much leaders within their organizations in terms of leading that conversation, leading the discussion around what does this potentially mean for us, and certainly helping that risk register, that potentially flat document line by line that is, we've all been in those meetings where it's reviewed as the last agenda item and perhaps not always given the time and space it might deserve. But how do we start to, let's deep dive into this and see what does this mean and where is this ultimately potentially coming from? And some of those factors may be external influences, but what's within our control that we can consider, and indeed how are those elements potentially impacting us, not just now and in the short term, but further down the line. Many organizations that we work with will have corporate plans that will stretch certainly towards the end of this decade, maybe even into 2030 and an early part of the next decade as well. How do we, how can we, broach that conversation of, well, what does those years look like potentially for us? And in order for us to get there, are there any decisions that we do need to be taking now that ultimately, builds us in that resilience that Martin's talking about? It allows that core to develop and to stretch and to utilize our strengths to ensure that the disruption that does occur, whether it's creeping or whether it's those immediate shocks, but we're ready for them. And we've certainly got some ideas and some plans on how we do want to bounce back and ensure that we have that resiliency. And I suppose to try and help and bring some of that to light, and I've got a couple of little tools that I do want to share with people, but I want to have a little look at in more detail around this short and long term. I also want to consider, are we actually overlooking some of our key risks within organizations? We sometimes get so fixated on certain big topic areas that they monopolize the conversation, and they take over. So I want to again have a little exploration of that, and I'll use the global risks as a backdrop of it. But if I start with the trends, there's a wide recognition and an acceptance that environmental risks over the longer term are going to have significant impact on the globe, and even at the more micro level in terms of how we're operating. We're seeing a community shift towards the recognition and the importance that these risks are placing. I know across local government a number of years ago, many organisations, identified net zero targets. Some of those targets are starting to feel a lot closer than when they were first set. Many of them, 2030 was seen as certainly a first hurdle. As I say, we're 5 years away from that deadline, and potentially in some areas. And those long-term impacts aren't going away. And you walk down the street, you talk to anybody connected to any walk of life really, and they'll be able to talk to you around, we see it in the news, there's increase in pollutions, extreme weather events. We're all living and breathing these things. There's been storms in the UK already in the first part of this year. We've seen other parts globally, California wildfires and how they took hold and took some abating and getting back into some sort of control. There's the widely accepted global temperature increases. We're seeing melting snow caps and things like that are starting to have significant impacts. However, what we do see and do recognise, and this has been alluded to already, is whilst we understand and see those long-term concerns, they are being in some ways largely overlooked by more immediate concerns and more immediate threats. And we've picked up on some of these earlier on when we were looking at sort of, what does the UK look like in terms of its short term, and indeed what do, a global outlook in the sort of next 2 years. And some of those really key elements that we're immediately concerned about are quite rightly monopolising a lot of time and thought at the moment, but we're not creating the connections between those short-term concerns and those longer term impacts that we do rightly recognise. And I've got a couple of ones on here that again it re-emphasises and picks up on those points from earlier on. But the global talent pool, or even the local level, the individuals that we've got available to us, and making sure that those key skills are they're within our organisations, and they're able to support the conversation. And indeed, that includes ourselves as risk managers, to make sure that we're the ones that are able to agitate that conversation in the right way and be provocative and ensure that discussion is not just focused on short-term goals and short-term achievements, but also considering what are the wider, further down the line implications. Alex has already alluded to things like social depravity and how that's shifting within many of our organisations, and in turn impacting on demand in services, and that in itself is having an impact on the finances, where we're having less available but needing in some cases to do more. The demand is increasing, and making sure that all of those decisions that we're juggling are ultimately and fundamentally being based on risk management and sound risk understanding of what those risks are associated to us now, and indeed further down the line going forwards. I mentioned around, are we overlooking certain key elements and certain key risks? So this is sort of an adaptation of the earlier graph that was in the pack and already discussed. I've left in those top three risks. So you know, you'll see the state-based armed conflict is in there, and as Alex mentioned, this is based on those respondents from a global perspective, given that list of 33, and what do you think are your biggest concerns? And you know, as you can see, those top three there, understandably in many cases, was to why they were picked out by a higher percentage of people. But what it got me thinking about was, what's at the bottom end of this 33 list? What are the risks that perhaps people aren't selecting because we're so concerned and so intensely aware of some of these areas that are, you know, in the news? They capture that information quite quickly, and they portray it out to us, and they dominate our thought processes. But what are the ones that are further down the list? And actually, there's some that have been picked up in terms of the UK's outlook. And you know, we've touched already on inflation. We touched already on talent, labour shortages. Both of those were selected by less than 1% of people who responded to the survey that was done for this global risk report. There's also some information there around the, you know, disruptions on supply chain, deterioration in health and well-being. I think is a really fascinating one. You know, that's not just workforce; it's those communities that we're working with and we're serving. That in turn has that knock-on impact of increasing demand of services that we're all involved in and providing, and then in turn how that impacts on our budgets and future demand of other services elsewhere down the line. What was really interesting, and slightly aside from this example, but same context, I did a piece of work recently, and it was a horizon scan exercise, you know, something that Martin and Alex have already alluded to in terms of our role as risk managers. We were doing this horizon scan exercise. And there was one particular risk within the group that we got very fixated on, and the group were almost discounting all of the risks because everything was almost coming underneath this umbrella of this significant transformational change that the organisation was starting to consider and was starting to build in. And actually, that became this organisation's version of that state-based armed conflict, if you like. You know, everyone in the room was saying that's our biggest risk, that's our biggest concern. But it was monopolizing the conversation to the point of everything else that was in corporate plans, that, you know, corporate plan was stretching for the next 3, 4, 5 years. Those risks, those ambitions, those objectives were being entirely overlooked because everything was deemed to be, we need to focus on this thing now. And it goes back to, you know, Martin's earlier question that he put up of how do we maintain that resilience and that delivery of the day to day in, you know, set against the backdrop of significant changes that's going on. And I think that's where we as risk leaders have that opportunity to make sure that we facilitate the conversation in the right way, to provoke in you know, in the most appropriate way, to build in some discussions, to make sure that we're agitating the thought process of other officers within the organisation, and how that breeds through. And I suppose what I've tried to build in here, and you know, a subtle play on actually our risk managers, are we the real Swiss Army knife? Do we need all of those different tools to be available to us to steer those conversations from any level within the organisation? We'll all be aware of risk management policies that will talk about risk being everybody's responsibility. It doesn't just sit with CLT, SLT, or you know, equivalent senior management within your own organisation. Actually, everybody that's got a responsibility has an equal right to be able to flag something. And I often talk about in training how, you know, risk will start out as one person's gut feel, and it's about sharing that gut feel and testing it amongst your colleagues and amongst your peers. And I've just put in some key thoughts here that Martin and I are having, and certainly sharing it amongst the rest of our team, of utilizing those tools to provoke discussion, to be curious, to be, professionally provocative. I think was a sort of alliteration that we were touching on, but recognizing that we are all part of the same organization. This is not about calling different individuals out. It's about, having that conversation in a professional capacity, that allows alternatives to be considered. It's not about, let's all agree with the most senior person in the room, and there's one on there around senior people speaking last within the room. Allowing all ideas to come through and facilitating that conversation, I think, is really, really key, particularly when it comes to reviewing your risks. And I mentioned earlier about how do we bring those risk registers to life, and actually is the day of the Excel or the Word document starting to fall away in the face of more sophisticated options that are available to organizations to ensure that they're getting the right level of risk data that supports some of these areas, that enables that discussion, that builds in some curiosity that people can have. And that will allow us to hopefully do some of these things. I've put in there around not remaining silent. Again, we've all been in those meetings where there's certain people around the table that may be the quieter ones, and how do we build the confidence and the trust that they've got within the process and the organization to be able to pull through their own ideas. The senior speaking, that's an interesting one. The session I did recently was with CLT, but within CLT there are more senior people within that organization, and I was deliberately forcing them to speak last. We'd got people on different tables, and we were moving the conversation around the tables to ensure that the table that got the chief risk officer, the chief executive on the table was actually the one that volunteered their thoughts penultimately, and that allowed everybody to have that conversation. It allowed everybody to speak, and certainly gave the opportunity for people. Everyone speaks once before one person speaks twice, and I think risk managers have got an opportunity to enable that discussion and to build that into us. And I know, Martin, you've had some thoughts yourself around sort of what tools are available to us, whether they're new tools or existing tools that we adapt. So I'll throw it back over to you.
Yeah, so it's a really interesting question, Matt. And I think this also starts to lean into the fact that as individuals, we probably all think about risk and interact with risk in a slightly different way. And on one hand, that's very good because that allows us to build diversity of thought and opinion, but it also can be counterproductive when we're trying to understand whether it's a project or a key decision as to whether to take that forward or otherwise. And if I just share an example, from my perspective, my risk career started in health and safety, and wearing my health and safety hat, regardless of the project, the first question that we always asked was, what could go wrong? And what is the worst possible outcome? And clearly, from a health and safety point of view, what we're looking to do is we're looking to protect employees, we're looking to protect people who may be harmed. And clearly, our approach to health and safety over the course of a number of years since the early 70s has had beneficial effects. But if we think about that from a business perspective, asking the question or having the perspective every time as to what can go wrong, and thinking about that almost as a default option is not very helpful. We need a more balanced approach. And one of the challenges for a risk manager is actually how do I facilitate that conversation in a group of people who do have these diverse thoughts and opinions and attitudes towards risk. And one of the tools that we've used successfully is, I believe he was Italian, Edward Di Bono, and I apologize if I've pronounced his surname incorrectly, a psychologist who basically came up with this six thinking hats method. And it's basically just a structured way of eliciting the right information or eliciting views and opinions and then arriving at a decision. From a risk perspective, I hope you can see how that would work. in terms of, depending on what hat you're wearing, you're either thinking about risk from a positive point of view or risk from a negative point of view. If you're wearing the white hat, for example, you're thinking about what information do I need to help make that decision. And then you can wear other hats to think about in terms of what's my gut instinct, what's my natural response to this, or other ways of achieving this. So the idea behind this is the facilitator who wears the blue hat encourages individuals or encourages the group to wear the same hat and then move on to the next hat. And then we can get a coherent view or voice and then make a decision from that. So it's a really useful tool in terms of group discussion. I also use it myself because I have a natural tendency, my first reaction faced with a decision is to ask for facts and information, or for more facts and information. I'll wear my white hat, but actually what I'll sometimes do is challenge myself, okay, wear the red hat. What's my gut instinct to that? And I think that just from an own personal development point of view is a useful tool. But just going back to your Swiss Army knife analogy, I think, you know, that is just one of the many tools that a risk manager needs in their armour.
Thank you, Martin. So before we open up the Q&A, I've just got last little slide that highlights some of the key points that we've alluded to this morning. And then Alex, I'm going to sort of bring you back in just to help us with some of the Q&A. And by all means, if you've got questions that you would like to throw in, now's the opportunity to do so. So just highlighting some of these key points from this morning. I think it's really important that we do consider that short-term and long-term implication of decisions that we're making. I understand the nature of the beast in terms of where we are at the moment, and it may well be that we are firefighting, we are having to deal with those very immediate conversations. But if we can steer that conversation and allow it to manifest around one of those longer-term impacts, then that's going to be really, really beneficial for us. Picking out a couple of the others that are on the screen, allowing time into risk management, both as your own team, but also fundamentally as an organisation, building in some of those tools that Martin's just talked about in more detail, the Swiss Army knife analogy, you know, making sure that you've got that ability to have that conversation that allows you to sort of provoke and have what we refer to as an intelligent conversation. And making sure that you are one of those key roles that spans every part of the organisation. It's very easy to think about the organisation in silos, but actually we have a really vital role to try and break down some of those silos and what they may or may not look like going forwards. So that's the end of the slides content, and thank you ever so much for being involved. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, but I absolutely welcome any questions that we may have had. Alex, I'll throw it to you.
Thank you. I am about 10 years out from being a local authority risk manager, but listening to all that, I kind of want to go back and get involved again. What an interesting time to be working in risk in the public sector. And I really liked all the tools that you then shared, a bit of a refresh. Hopefully people have got something there that they hadn't thought about and aren't using, and can go and implement them. I've got a couple of questions, and a couple of questions and comments have come through, but as Matt said, while I'm talking, please do take the opportunity to pose any questions that you might have in the chat. But if we start off with, so we talked about economic risks, we talked about funding. It's been front of mind for a long time. That there are a lot of public and voluntary sector risk functions that aren't as funded or as well resourced as they have been in the past, or they might like to be. So if you are a risk professional working on your own or without a risk fund to pull on, what should you prioritise, and how should you work with what you've got to embed risk management in those kinds of circumstances?
I'll jump in because Martin's on mute. What do we prioritise? Martin alluded to that sort of organisation resilience core, and I suppose the sort of what are the core functions of a risk manager? It comes back to making sure we've got the right information, making sure that we've got consistent ways of recording. And for me, it's not about, don't overcomplicate it. I often talk to organizations, we're not here to make a cottage industry out of this. It needs to infiltrate into other existing processes that you'll have got within your own organizations. If we've already got something else, for argument's sake, performance is reporting really well. Well, can we piggyback onto some of those elements, and can we utilize what we have got to ensure that ultimately risks are proportional and reflective of our own maturity and our own, Martin talked about culture earlier on. Getting those core principles right allow us to grow and develop, and that, I think, should be where the priority is. And Martin, I don't know if you want to add.
Yes, sorry, I was just distracted by some of the questions coming through on chat there. In terms of priorities or maximizing limited resource, I think it's also a case of, you've touched on it there, is joining the dots, is to if I recall, so like a couple of days ago, I was delivering a session around business continuity for a group of senior managers in a local authority, and what we consistently talked about through the course of the day and a half was, how do we join the dots with the things that you're already doing, so we don't make business continuity, we don't make risk a separate discipline. We actually make it business as usual. So how we integrate it into business planning, how do we integrate it into performance management, and I think looking for those opportunities to join the dots is important. And I think also as well, quite clearly resource is needed. So it is finding your advocates or supporters at the top table and really demonstrating the value in risk management as well. And I think that's a case of, because the trouble is, in terms of if we just view risk management as protection, then quite often the argument will come back is, how do we actually assess the value of that if something has not happened because of risk management? If we can demonstrate the value of something happening because we understand risk, because we've taken an appropriate and balanced risk, then I think again that starts to bring in the senior table to the conversation around supporting risk management in the future.
Thank you. Yeah, so the questions are coming in thick and fast now, so we will work through them as quickly as we can. So the first one that came in as a question, could you touch on non-financial EWI? I assume you mean early warning indicators. So what early warning indicators could be non-financial? How can you stress test these? Matt, do you have any comments you'd like to add on that one?
Oh, yes. Where do I start, I suppose, is the question. Your processes around risk stress test, how do we deep dive into certain areas to allow some of those red flags that we may be picking up in other areas to start to work their way through in terms of, actually, is this an early sign of a longer term impact, and do we need to be recognizing that link and drawing that interdependency between some of those key risk elements to it. It's risk management isn't an exact science. It'd be great if it was. It'd be great if we had all the answers all the time. We're always making best guesses. I think making sure we've got the right people and the right stakeholders involved in those conversations is really key. We've talked a lot about, making sure the conversation is appropriate and is professional and all those sorts of things. They will help us. But ultimately, risk is around the discussion. We need to keep that discussion going and keep it flowing. Martin, I can see you itching to jump in.
Yeah. So I just seem to have trouble with my mute button today, so apologies for that. The early warning indicators, the non-financial piece is really interesting, and I think it's almost links back to what I was saying before about joining the dots within the organisation. So Matt, for example, was talking about labour and skill shortages. So early warning indicators there, what I'm thinking about there is the data that you as an organisation are holding in terms of retention levels, in terms of staff turnover, for example. But it might be softer elements that you're collecting in terms of things like cultural or staff engagement surveys. These will start to give an indication potentially of staff, the level of staff engagement, or the level of staff, let's use the word happiness, within the organisation, which then would be an early indicator of actually we've got a retention problem here. So again, it's not creating an industry out of this. It's looking at other parts of the business where we can pull that information from.
Thank you very much. I'm going to jump down now to a question about the extreme weather risks. So what are the key mitigating actions that local authorities should be taking in response to the extreme weather risks that feature? So they're there in the top two, both short and long term. I would say before I throw it over to you to answer, so within Zurich Resilience Solutions, there is another practice, the climate resilience practice, which is this is what they do day in, day out, look at responses to extreme weather risks. So do get in touch if you want to know more about that. But in the meantime, just what are the key things that local authorities should be doing in response to those extreme weather risks? Matt or Martin?
I'll take this one first, since I've stayed off mute. I think the first thing is actually understanding your risk. We've talked about throughout this presentation in terms of limited resource, limited capacity to respond. So any way that we are going to respond needs to be focused and needs to be directed. So what exactly is your extreme weather event risk now, but also thinking about it in the future as well. So understanding your risk exposure, and again, the focus historically has been very much around like wet weather events, storm and flooding. What we mustn't lose sight of is, for example, heat and the potential rise in heat that we will experience over the UK, and what that might mean for our vulnerable communities or service users that we are serving. So, my first response to this is actually understanding the risk now, but also what that risk projected will look like. And in terms of that, the data that we now have available to us allows us to build scenarios as to what the increase in potential flood water will be, or the increase in flood risk, and therefore the increase in flood levels may be, and also what that increase in temperature may be as well. So understand the risk initially, and then we're starting to look at it. If we're talking about a local authority perspective, then and indeed a housing association, we'll need to look at this from a portfolio perspective. Which areas do we need to protect from a wider community point of view? And this is where we need to tie into what's happening in terms of government funding around flood defences, for example. And there was an announcement a couple of days ago, I believe, around commitment to spending. The thing I would say there is that, yes, there is a commitment, but there is also the proof of the pudding in terms of when that actually materialises as well. I think also we shouldn't lose sight of the fact of we need to prepare our communities, our residents, our service users as well. So what do we need to be doing to encourage some self-help as well, to ensure that they are resilient, to ensure that they are prepared as well? Matt, do you have any other observations at all?
Only you're absolutely right. Knowing what you've got and where your concerns are is first and foremost key. I suppose you're then playing into, well, how do we respond to an incident, and how can we, what business continuity efforts and plans have we got in place? But not just having them, how do we test them? Ideally in a safe, it's all well and good having a plan that then when the incident happens, it kicks in. But if we can test that in a safe place and start to understand, to make sure that our plans are valid, then that in turn will help us build that resilience in. So yeah, understand what you've got, build your plans, and then test it, I think would be sort of really key.
Great. Right, so there are a couple of questions on there and comments that we're not going to have time to get to, so we will pick up on those. Michelle, particularly, I'll pick up on yours. But if we finish with, we thought this would come up, so thank you, Stephen, for the question. There is a question here about, for local government organisations, devolution and reorganisation being potentially on the horizon in the sort of short to medium term now. Major risk for some local authorities at the moment. It is a risk in its own right, but may also affect other risk areas. Matt and Martin, before we finish, have you got any comments about how risk professionals might want to be starting to think about how they respond to that devolution reorganisation agenda?
I'll kick off. Absolutely, it's potential for a period of significant change. I think, again, in terms of risk managers being prepared for this, it's being front and foremost of those conversations to understand what is being planned, how it is being planned, and providing that challenge in terms of what we know about reorganisation. Local authorities are resource constrained at the moment. Reorganisation requires resources to deliver that successfully. And I think sometimes the expectations of reorganisation are unrealistic. There needs to be an acceptance that our primary objective at day one and on vesting days to be safe and legal, and then transformation will follow from that. And I think sometimes organisations can be overly ambitious, overstretch themselves, and that in themselves will introduce additional risk to the organisation or to the new organisations. So I think being that voice of reason, the risk manager has an important role to play there. Matt, do you want to add anything?
Well, only to echo that, yes, I agree with your sort of question, your statement, Stephen. I think the other side of it is it's easy to focus on risk and the negative, but there's a role here for the risk manager to perhaps consider and allow the consideration of what opportunities are potentially available within some of this conversation. It's likely to happen based on all the news that we're seeing. Some of this is, and in some organisations, it's perhaps close to the short term than it is in others. So how do we maintain some of the delivery of the status quo whilst building in that transition and the ability for that, and some of those conversations that we've sort of alluded to earlier on today, and certainly what Martin said. But I think for me, allowing opportunities to be brought out and allowed to flourish within that conversation is useful.
Fabulous, thank you. Right, so we're out of time. Sorry. Thank you everyone for joining us today. As I said, there is more to come on other areas. We're going to be looking at property, motor, safeguarding risk, among many other things, and probably revisiting that last question in the months to come. So thank you for joining us. You'll be sent a link to this recording. So as I say, if you want to watch it back or share it with anyone, and please do get in touch with any further questions or any support and guidance you may want around any of the areas discussed today. Thank you, Matt and Martin, and thank you everyone. Again, enjoy the rest of your day and your weekend, and we will see you all soon. Thank you.
Thank you.